bars. His fine collection of gold bars and diamonds. Yeah. And his dry sense of humor. I can't imagine anyone in the Brady family has a dry sense of humor.
My brother has a pretty dry sense of humor.
Yeah.
Which one are you talking about? Robert.
He's good looking old man.
He's 35. That's no excuse. He's got 4 kids.
Okay.
That's a big word.
Yeah. So what does inheritance mean? Because we often use it in money, and depending on if your parents have any or not. Like I think my inheritance is going to be like a house, which is not nothing, but I think beyond that, like pretty much nothing. But like I plan to spend everything. So my plan for my kids' inheritance is like just my debt. But it's a joke. I'm not going to leave anything to my kids. Sorry? I'm worried that my sister is honestly considering the possibility of having it taxidermied, and I don't. I have this odd feeling. I think my sister has, yeah, and my sister stole my dog during COVID. Ruby used to be my dog. Now Ruby's my sister's dog. Sorry.
Like when she was alive?
Yeah. No, she didn't steal her dead, and is now like holding onto the body. No. Okay. So my sister, well, I'll tell you the story. So first of all, yes, listen, you'll learn sometimes in life, you're in a relationship and you think things are going well, and then somebody swoops in and steals somebody from you you're in a relationship with. And at first that hurts, and you're bitter, and your feelings are hurt, and you think about slashing somebody's tires. But then you realize that in the end, the heart wants what the heart wants. And if everyone's happier in this new arrangement, then you just have to move on. You can't be bitter. So in this particular case, my sister had cancer, and she had surgery. And she was in the hospital, like in the in the recovery ward, like just one day out of surgery when COVID happened. And it was literally the day before. And one of the nurses said to her, like, tomorrow, like they're going to put this ward on lockdown. Nobody's going to be able to come and go. And she was scheduled to be there for like 4 days of recovery. And she said, like, we don't know what this looks like. Like, you remember how, like, you remember we went on March break and then just never came back to school? So they just said, like, you might want to discharge yourself and go home. And so Amy did, my sister, and but she was not ready to be home. And then she didn't want to go back to the hospital because, and like she'd had, this may be too much information, but she had to have a total hysterectomy. So she had to have her uterus removed, which obviously, as you can imagine, results in major hormonal changes, right? Like major. So my sister was always like the most calm, cool, collected, and is again the most calm, cool, collected, like well put together. She's just a stable person. She got all these stable genes. I got all of the like jittery, not stable genes. And all of a sudden, she was like having panic attacks every night. She was not, and she was physically not recovering well. So my wife would go over every day. My wife's a midwife, and just kind of check on her and kind of help her. And she's like, Amy is having a meltdown. And her husband, my brother-in-law, had to go back to work. He was a butcher, and he managed the butcher department at a grocery store. And again, if you remember at COVID, like essential workers had to go in, right? But none of his employees were coming in. So he was working like 80-hour weeks. So I started taking my dog over and said, oh, why don't you hang out with Ruby? And Ruby, and Amy took to each other. And then I would say, well, do you want to keep Ruby overnight? And then night would turn to a week. And then like one day she phoned me up and she said, hey, Ruby needs to go to the vet. I'm going to drop her off. And I realized at some point, like, I think now this is Amy's dog and I'm just paying for the vet bills, right? And so, no. And so I said, like, Amy, is Ruby your dog now? And she said, I think she is. Yeah. And I said, and then I knew this had happened when she I was like, oh yeah, my friend's dog sitting Ruby because I'm away for the weekend. I was like, Ruby is my dog, Amy. Like, why didn't you just bring Ruby back to her home? And that's when I realized that Amy had stolen my dog. But I'm at peace with it now. I have a new dog. His name is Arlo.
Are they friends?
And he's the best dog ever, so it's fun.
Is Ruby and Arlo friends?
No, they hate one another.
Oh.
But I find that really enjoyable. Ruby, Arlo's like the nicest dog ever, but he's just like, he's only a year and a half, right? So he's still kind of a pup. He's hyperactive. Ruby's old now. She's 9 and she just wants to be left alone. So Arlo always goes over like tail wagging all excitedly, and Ruby just like bites her and then go away. And that's it. Anyway, enough about my dog. Inheritance. So we know now, that traits are the result of different alleles of genes in our chromosomes. We know that traits are the results of different genes and different alleles of the same genes in our chromosomes. Now, somebody quickly remind me what that means. What are different alleles of the same genes versus different genes?
Like, the same section of DNA from the mother and the father.
Mm-hmm.
So like the eye color gene, but just from different.
That's right. In other words, we are different from carrots because we have a gene that gives us eyes, right? We have actually a bunch of genes it takes to make eyes, but we have eyes, and genes control that. So we have different genes from a carrot, and that's why we have eyes and they don't. On the other hand, I have some blue-eyed in here. Yeah, so Kaylin and I have different colored eyes, right? So we both have the gene for eyes, but we have slightly different versions of that. So that is different alleles of the same gene. What could be a synonym for allele? Synonym for allele. Yeah, copy, not bad. Copy works well. I've used version a bit. Does that make sense? And that kind of rings true to me to say you have different versions of, or different like variations of could be another synonym, and different alleles of the same genes. But of course, before the discovery of DNA, this wasn't known. Of course, right? Like, but it was predicted. And when I say DNA was predicted, it doesn't really mean that like they predicted that there'd be this molecule that is a spiral and things like that, but rather it's to say that we had a sense of the idea of inheritance. So it's obviously been known for a long time, since time immemorial, that traits get passed on. So from parent to offspring, right? We know that if you plant an apple tree, you're going to get another apple tree. We know that if you plant a pea tree, you're going to get another, or a pea plant, you're going to get another pea plant. Not only that, we know that if you plant seeds from an apple tree where the apples are like really big and delicious and good to eat, likely that's what the tree you get will be like. On the other hand, if you plant the seeds from an apple tree that has crappy little apples, probably that's what you'll get. So we also know that we can, selectively breed. That's been happening for a long time immemorial, before people were writing stuff down. But I want to introduce you to a guy named Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. This guy's a botanist. He's a scientist, but in the way that sort of people were scientists in the 18th century. All right, 18th century scientist. So this is a guy who is a naturalist. In other words, he studies living species. And he proposed a theory of what we call blended inheritance. What does that mean? By the way, if I spell inheritance the same way twice in this note, it will be a major victory for Italy and Canada. Yes. Let me draw that idea for you. The basic idea is this. Suppose you have a parent, and that parent is really tall. And then you have that person procreating with another parent who is pretty short. All right? So this is what we're going to call the P generation. P, of course, standing for parent. Then the idea is, if we look at the F1 generation, which is just a fancy way of saying their children, what would you expect to see? And the idea is, Lamarck says, well, you would expect, and we see for the most part, that if we had two tall parents, you can almost guarantee what do their kids look like? They're really tall. But when you have a tall parent and a short parent, well, what you kind of expect is that most of the offspring will kind of fall within that range, and there'll be a blend of those two, right? Does that make sense? You would expect the average offspring to kind of have heights that go in the middle there. And notably, there's some variation, right? But variation could be accounted for lots of things. Maybe diet, maybe one kid ate more, maybe one kid went to bed every night by tying their feet to a tree and hanging from it so they got stretched out. I don't know. Maybe one of them was tortured on one of those ancient rack things, you know, the one you like spin the thing. But the basic idea is the theory. I'm going to put this in a different color to show that this is his theory. The F1 generation, and that's just children, will have traits that are a blend or an average of the parental traits. And this is around the time of Charles Darwin. Does anyone know what Charles Darwin is famous for, what his sort of contribution to biological sciences is? Yeah. Sorry? Yeah, well, he studied a lot of animals, including finches, famously finches in the Galapagos Islands and their beaks. But yeah, Charles Darwin was another British naturalist. He went on a voyage, I think, is it a 7-year voyage? It's a long trip, I know that, aboard a ship called the HMS Beagle. I don't know if I was going to spend 7 years on a trip if I'd want it to be called the HMS Beagle. You think you'd want a name like, I don't know, like the Panther, like the Sea Lion or something. But Beagle. Anyway, and he studied beaks of finches, and he studied tortoises and turtles, and he studied cormorants and all kinds of birds and all kinds of other flora and fauna, and he's the person who first gives us the theory of what? Natural selection, the evolution. He wrote a book called famously On the Origin of the Species. And his idea is, he's obviously not the first person to notice that traits get passed on, but he develops this theory that, like, hey, the Galapagos is this really interesting place because it's these islands that are far enough away from each other that animals can't get from one to the other, but we know that they formed from one big island, and when sea level rose, they got separated. So we have this place where, like, animals have been separated from each other for just a few million years. And when you go there, they are similar to each other, but they are new and different species, and those species seem to be specifically well suited to the islands they're on, right? In other words, on islands that have big trees where they have big seeds, you found birds that have big beaks that are good at crushing big seeds. But when you go to a smaller island that just has low shrub brush, you get these birds that have very delicate beaks that are good at eating little seeds, right? But they're obviously related to each other, and they think they came from a single stock. And he comes from the idea that as animals change over time, they adapt to their environment. And then you said natural selection. What's natural selection mean?
Either survival based on the instincts.
Yeah, so listen, I'm on an island, and I'm a finch, and I just happen to have a beak that's just a little bit bigger than all the other finches. And we get a year where, like, only the big trees survive because it's a kind of drought year, so big trees can hang on because they have reserves and deep roots, but the small little plants can't. There's only big seeds. I survive better than all my friends. Who gets to do the most procreating? I do. That happens over enough generations. All of a sudden, over time, what are all the animals on that island like? Well, they all have these big beaks, right? Whereas over here, where you have the opposite conditions, where there's waves coming up all the time and washing away big growth, and you can't get big trees, but you get low-lying shrubs that sit down, and big windstorms knock over big trees. Well, over there, now the small-beaked animals have an advantage, and eventually those changes become significant enough that you have different species. That's not Lamarck, that's Darwin. But that doesn't answer the fundamental question, well, why do some birds have bigger beaks and some have smaller? And Lamarck's idea is that the reason that happens is that we get these blended traits. And his idea then, you don't have to write this, but say you talk about, like, how do you get a giraffe? Well, a giraffe kind of looks like what animal with an enormous neck? That's right? Kind of a horse, right? So you can imagine you have a little horse, and all the other horses are eating all the leaves like they are, but one horse has a slightly longer neck, right? Well, who's going to have the best time eating those leaves? One with the long neck, right? When he procreates. Even if he procreates with just a regular, not long-necked horse, well, the offspring will have that middle one there. But then his idea is, well, what if that horse is really stretching its neck up all the time, and it gets even a little longer during his lifetime? He's just able to kind of kink it a little bit longer and get up a little higher than all the other horses. And he passes that on to his kids, right? then that's an advantage. If that happens generation after generation, eventually you get draft. By the way, that's mostly what happens. The only question he had is this idea of how it gets passed along, which is by kind of meeting in the middle. Does that make sense? So this theory was a strong start, but flawed. And hopefully you recognize that, because is there anyone here who is distinctly taller or distinctly shorter than both of their parents? I am distinctly taller than both my parents. My mom's like 5'6", my dad's like 5'4". And so I'm not very tall. I'm only like 5'9", but I'm markedly taller than both of them. Am I a blend of their two traits? Doesn't fit, right? Manat, did you put a hand up? In what way? What's a... Yeah? Yeah. So, but it's strong start but flawed. And so now we enter another scientist, another naturalist, a Russian guy named Gregor Mendel.
Greg? Your kid?
Gregor Mendel. So no, he's not my kid. He's long dead. Long dead. So Gregor Mendel was a Russian botanist, studied, amongst other things, pea plants. Settle down. All right. And here's what he finds. He has some purebred tall plants. And are you ready for some beautiful art? I use green because, of course, we're drawing plants here. So here I have a pea plant, and it's pretty freaking tall. And there it is. Okay, look at me. I'm a pea plant. And this is purebred tall. And when I say something's purebred, something that people have been doing for a long time is they find that if you pick the two tallest plants and let them breed together, and then the next generation you pick the two tallest plants and you let them breed together, and the next generation you pick the two tallest plants and you let them breed together, eventually you'll get a purebred, which means that now when you take the seeds from these plants, you never get any little ones. You only get big ones. Does that make sense? So we've known for a long time that if there's some trait you like, if you just keep inbreeding, which somebody talked about that the other day, by the way, like the incest of it all. If there's a trait you want, that's how you get that trait. This, by the way, is why royal families inbred. They believe that they were special and given to the earth by God to rule people. And so if you have special traits that make you better than everyone else and you should rule everybody, how do you make sure you don't lose those traits? You inbreed, right? Does that make sense? Who's fit to marry somebody who's a king? Well, only somebody else who's the offspring of a king. Does that make sense? There's a logic to it. We've known that for a long time. So if we take purebred tall plants, still in science class today, kids. Mr. Lander told us that incest makes sense.
Is that when people marry their first cousins?
I couldn't tell you. So what if we took a purebred tall pea plant and we bred it with a purebred short pea plant? And again, these are plants that when you breed them purely, give you 100% just the same trait. So we have purebred tall and purebred short. Hello.
Hey, Lefty was just good. He said that's what you're looking
Oh,
for.
God bless you.
Is that what you
Amazing.
want?
Yes.
Yeah, cool.
Thank
Have fun.
you. Oh, fantastic.
Enjoy your competition there on inverse.
Thank you. That's what we do in the science hallway. It's all inbreeding all the time. Okay, so...
Excuse me?
No. So what does Lamarck tell us we should expect? What does Lamarck tell us we should expect? Lamarck tells us that we should expect that if we had, the tall goes here and the short goes there, we should expect, the average offspring to kind of look like that. Most of them are going to be somewhere in the middle, right? And certainly kind of in the range. And yet, that's the expected outcome. The actual outcome, much more interesting.
It'll either be super short or super tall.
No. Always tall. Always tall. So in this case, the average would be in the middle. So in other words, Lamarck isn't stupid. He doesn't think every plant is going to be average height, but he thinks that if you take enough of them, they'll average in the middle. Does that make sense? Some might be as tall as dad, some might be as short as mom, but on average, they're going to land in the middle. And they're going to live within that range. But the actual outcome that Mendel gets is any time he breeds like this, 100% of the F1 generation is tall. Just like the purebred talls. So this is the P generation. And the F1 generation, 100% of them are tall. Explain that.
Because the tall gene is stronger.
He doesn't know about genes. He doesn't know about genes. How's that make any sense? So, what would you do? Well, you'd inbreed. That's what you'd do. You'd inbreed. No, what he says now is, okay, we know that the way we got these tall plants to begin with was by pure breeding, right? But okay, now when we take pure breeding and turn it into impure breeding, we get this weird thing where they still seem purebred on the other end, right? Weird. So now let's see what he does. So Mendel studies this in detail and over several generations. And we're just going to look at the F1 and F2 generations. So what he does is, and this is just going to be redrawing what we had there, but that's okay, is he starts with the P generation, which is a purebred tall being bred with a purebred short plant. All right? That's the P1 generation. So the only thing he starts with is plants where one parent, I said P1, but it's just P generation, is a purebred tall bred with a pure short. And we've already said what the first generation looks like. By the way, what do we call the first generation? Nope, that's the parents. The first offspring. F1. So the F1 generation, which is their offspring, like we said, they end up 100% tall. So now the question is like, okay, do tall plants, whatever makes them tall, when they breed, do they just pass that on? And now once that's in the system, it's there forever? In other words, like, is tallness in some way dominant such that like once something has that information, like too bad, now you're going to be tall forever, even if we breed you with a short plant? And kind of looks that way, right? So this is 100% tall. But we can't really say it's purebred anymore, can we? Because even though it's 100% tall, we didn't make it the way we normally make purebreds, which is by only breeding them with tall things. We made it by breeding them with short things. So now what's he do? Well, now we made this by crossing those two together. Well, you know, all's fair in love and war with plants. He breeds these together, right? He breeds the offspring with each other. And so now, if you breed the offspring together, you can get a second generation, which is grandkids, but F2 generation isn't just grandkids. It's grandkids if we haven't introduced any new genes. Yep? Yeah, go ahead. So, to be clear, the F2 generation is produced by breeding the F1 generation with each other. So there's no new genes coming in. There's no new information coming in. And what do we see here? You tell me, what do we see here? They going to be tall? They all going to be tall? Sorry? Are they going to be short? What are they going to be? And the answer is, you don't just do it with two. Like I'm showing this here because I'm not going to draw like a whole greenhouse full of plants, right? But you do it with thousands. And here's what he finds. Consistently. That he goes through and he looks, and like the first one he looks at is tall. He's like, oh, interesting. And the second one he looks at is tall. He's thinking, this is so weird, right? And then the third one he looks at is tall. And by now you're thinking, okay, like this must just be the case then that like once you've purebred plants to be tall, they stay tall. But then this crazy thing happens, which is the fourth one is short. And it's not kind of somewhere in the middle. It's just as short as the original short guy. And in this case, we get this very specific 3-to-1 ratio of tall to short. Right? Here we had 100% tall. Here we had 50-50. So it's weird. You go from 50-50 to 100% one thing to 75% tall, 25% short. What is going on? And then he actually, I'm not going to make us draw this out, but he actually then says, well, what if we breed these together randomly? What if I always pick a random plant from here and breed it with another random plant from here? What does the next generation look like? Does that make sense? I'm not going to go through all that, but he makes a discovery. He does some math, he does some clever thinking, and he makes a discovery, and he makes a logical kind of conclusion. And what he concludes is this. The first one is something that's already said, and I think somebody even used the word, which is what can we say about tallness and shortness in pea plants as a trait? Tallness as a trait is what? Is dominant over shortness. In other words, it seems to be that there's some kind of information inside of these living things that makes them tall. And if you have that information, if you have the hey be a tall plant information, and you have the hey be a short plant information, it looks like that what you end up being is tall. Does that make sense? Right? If you get both sets of instructions, we know that because we took a purebred tall, so that seed is definitely going to have the information for tallness. And then we take the pollen from this one over here, which is from purebred short, so it's got to be short. We put them together, we get tall plant. And by the way, you can switch it. Instead of taking the seed that's tall and the pollen that's short, let's switch it. Let's take a seed that's, I don't know what I just said, but whatever the opposite of that is, you get the same result. It's always tall. So it's not about who's mom and who's dad. It's not about whether it's the female sex cell or the male sex cell. It just seems that if you take purebred tall and you take purebred short, you put them together every time, 100% of the time, you get something that's tall. So that trait must be dominant. But it's obviously not the case that the short information has gone away because it does poke its head back up. Does that make sense? We do see it. We end up with some plants later on down the line that are short again. But it's there. And so then he makes the other discovery, which is a mathematical discovery. He's looking at this ratio, and he's able to figure out that 2 is a magic number. And it makes sense that 2 is a magic number. How many parents do you have? 2. I mean, is it conceivable that procreation could require 3 organisms? Sure, it doesn't. Like, that's not how it happens with us. But, like, there's nothing magical about the idea that we need 1 copy from mom and 1 copy from dad. Why not 1 copy from mom, 1 copy from dad, and 1 copy from Gary? I don't know. Like, the point being, right? I don't know. But the point being, but he notices that, like, you have 2 parents, but, like, the number 2 works into this ratio. Now, you might ask, how the hell does the number 2 work into that ratio? What's that ratio? 3-to-1. Where's the 2?
3 minus 1.
Okay, why are we subtracting?
Because.
But our friend Gregor Mendel, he's pretty good at math. And here's what he figures out. What he figures out is that we must have, or not we must, this is pea plants, the plants must have two sets of instructions for height. Each parent must only pass one of those on. And this is where he comes up with the idea of genes and alleles. Basically, we have a gene, and the gene is the instruction to determine a trait of some sort. And by the way, he doesn't just study their height. I use this example, but he looks at the color of their seeds. He finds the same pattern. He looks at whether they have round pea seeds or wrinkly pea seeds. He finds the same pattern. Put that phone away. Okay. I'm sorry. I apologize for being difficult. So now, in this example, there's a gene and there's two alleles for it. And he gives us this convention of using the letter T for tallness. So here we have two alleles. This particular gene, there's two alleles, two versions of it. And the big T gene says, make a tall pea plant. I'm just going to say tall. And the little t says short. And the reason he comes up with this convention is by convention he decides that the dominant trait will be uppercase. And what does he call the trait that isn't dominant? Very good. And he makes the recessive trait have a lowercase thing. So now, that's really all the information he needs to test his theory. So now we can go back to our original drawing and we can talk about what this looks like. So let's talk about what it looks like. So let's take our tall plant, right? And our short plant, and let's take Mendel's idea. Now we said these were purebred. So if they're purebred and we've spent hundreds of generations making sure that this is tall, what two copies is it going to have? It's going to have a copy that says be tall, and it's going to have a second copy that says be tall. In other words, it got the instruction from its mama plant, be tall, and from daddy plant, be tall. All right? So this one is tall. And of course, the little guy here, he got what instruction? That looks much more like a person than a plant. There we go. I think in the middle I forgot I was drawing a plant. What does it have? Little t. Yeah, it's not much use saying t, by the way. That's one of the. It's okay. That's one of the flaws of this system. But this definitely says be short. Does that make sense? Now, when we breed these, we said we get offspring, and all the offspring are tall. Does that make sense? But tell me what their instructions look like. Because they are all the product of mom and dad, right? So if you think about it, how many possible ways could we combine them? Well, plant could pass this one on and have it go with that one, right? Or it could take this one and have it pair up with that one. In that case, what will they both be? Big T, little t. Or it could take this one and pair it with that one, in which case it will be big T, little t. Or it could take this one and pair it with that one, in which case it will be. So all of their offspring are actually going to be the same. Does that make sense? And what are all their offspring going to have? Well, they're all going to have a big T from the purebred tall plant, and they're going to have a little t from that. But what we know is, what does this look like? It's tall. And that's how we decided that tallness must be dominant. Does that make sense? Because if you have one of each, you're tall. So now, let's talk about breeding this with itself. All right, so we're going to give it a breeding partner, and we're going to give it a breeding partner which happens to be its sibling, who has, for the gene we're talking about, the exact same genes, because we said 100% of this generation is going to have that arrangement, right? So I really only needed to draw one, except I want to breed with them, right? Now, what was the ratio on the other side? 3 to 1. So we're going to have to draw all four of them. There's one, and it's tall. And there's the second one, and he's tall. And there's a third one, and he is also tall. And then we got a wee little guy at the end. He's just a short little guy, right? Okay. What has happened here? Well, let's look at it from a perspective of these instructions. Because this big instruction, it's possible that that's the one that gets passed on. Because Mendel says this only works if they only get to pass one on. So maybe this guy passes this one on. What could it pair up with? Well, it could pair up with this one. In which case, what will the offspring be? In what way, though? What are the two instructions? Yeah, big, tall instruction, tall instruction. And that actual plant will be tall. Not only tall, it's actually a purebred tall plant. Do we all see that? Even though neither of its parents was purebred, what is it? It's purebred. Isn't that kind of crazy? But that's what Mendel predicts, is that actually 25% of your offspring are going to be purebred, even though their parents weren't. Because what were their grandparents? Purebred. Interesting. Maybe you're already seeing why this kind of looks, but we'll go through it. Let's do the next pairing. Let's go purple. What if this tall one ends up with that instruction? What do we have here? Now dad is saying, hey, be a tall plant, but mom's saying, you can be short. And what is it? Tall. Why is it tall if we've got two instructions? Because tall is a dominant gene. Or not the dominant gene, it's the dominant allele. It's the dominant allele. Because they're both just genes that say, hey, you should have some height to you. The allele is where one says we're going to be a tall plant. The other one says, we're going to be a short plant. All right. Okay, what's the next combination that's possible? Well, we could have this little guy with the uppercase one there. And by convention, we're going to see that if it has one of each, we don't actually care which parent came first. Just as kind of a manners thing, we always do the uppercase first. Doesn't really matter, but we'll do it to be consistent. And what's that one look like? Tall. It's also a mixed breed, right? It has one instruction that says tall, one instruction that says be short. And then finally, what's the last possible combination? Well, we could have this little one here, that one there, and we actually here have another purebred plant. And this one is purebred lowercase, lowercase, which means what's this one look like? Yeah, another little short guy. Does that make sense? That's why we get the 3-to-1 ratio. So, this is what Mendel comes up with. And again, he comes up with this without knowing that there's such thing as DNA, without knowing that there's such things as genes and alleles. He's inventing these concepts. That's pretty impressive, right? And keep in mind that nature doesn't work perfectly. In other words, if you tried to do this lab and you only produce 4 plants, you're not necessarily going to get 3-to-1 ratio. 3-to-1 ratio. Does that make sense? Because there's a random element to it, right? You know that there's roughly 50-50 males and females in the population, roughly even odds. And yet, how many of you come from a family where the ratio is perfect, 1-to-1? My mom did. My mom's family went girl, boy, boy, girl, boy, girl, boy, girl, boy, girl. And my dad's family went girl, boy, girl, boy, girl, boy, girl, boy. And then even crazier on my mom's side, like there, all the grandchildren followed that same pattern too. That happens to just be dumb luck. It just worked out that way. It's kind of crazy, but that's just random, because there's always an element of randomness to it. So Mendel had to do this with a lot of numbers. Does that make sense? But he found this ratio. And again, it wasn't just height. I'm using height as an example because I don't want to throw 15 things at you. But he found this pattern worked for a bunch of different traits he looked at. And so he comes up with the idea of the gene and the allele. And so now we get some terms, which is that we have what he calls the genotype. And this describes the alleles of a certain trait and the term phenotype. Now, hopefully, genotype is pretty obvious. It comes from geno, which just refers to the genetics, right? The information. Pheno comes from phenos, which means like image, how something looks. So this describes the observable trait. Observable trait of the organism. So in other words, genotype says what alleles an organism has for a certain gene, and the phenotype says what does that thing look like. Does that make sense? What are the alleles? And this says, what's it look like? So if we look at our plant simulation here, there are three possible, so we could say for plant height, in Mendel's case, we have three different genotypes. We laid them out here. What are the three possible genotypes? You could be big T, or you could be big T, or you could be little t. These are the genotypes. And we give these names. What do we call it if you have two copies of the same allele? Well, there's a prefix for that. We know it. We tend to think of this in terms of sexuality. When people are sexually attracted to somebody of the same gender that they are, we say that they are homosexual. So homo, same, as a prefix. So we call this homozygous. And zygous here refers to like the zygote, basically like the same embryo, which isn't great language. It would have been better to call this like homogenetic or something, right? But they don't. They call it homozygous. That's the term they use. I don't make it up. And in this case, they're the same, but we have to be more specific. They're homozygous. And which copy do they have? They have the dominant. So we would refer to this as being a homozygous dominant individual. On the other hand, what would we call this one here? They have two copies of the same. Yeah, and what's the word we use for that? Very good. So we have homozygous dominant. Good job, guys. Between the two of you, we got it. And we call it recessive. On the other hand, what do we call it when they have one of each? Hetero what? Yeah, perfect. Man, you guys are good. I love that after a week of me like grinding you down with lessons, you're still like figuring stuff out. That's impressive. Very impressive. My God, am I complimenting you people? What's wrong with me? Quick, I'll say 4 mean things. It's what? The mad cow? I could only possibly be nice if I have the mad cow. That's what you're telling me? It hurts my feelings. Samantha Brady. I'm nice outside of this class. Wow. Thank you? Question mark. Yeah, so there's three possible. I'm not making a graph. I'm just making a little table here. I don't even know why I'm bothering with that. I just felt like it was messy. So those are the genotypes. And then what's the other term? The phenotype. And in this case, how many phenotypes do we have in this particular case? There's only 2 phenotypes. Because if you're homozygous dominant for plant height, what's your phenotype? What's the observable trait? What do you look like?
Tall.
You're tall. The heterozygote is also tall. But the homozygous recessive is short. So Mendel, before even knowing there's such thing as DNA, is able to realize that some of these and some of these have different information. And he calls that information genes. And he calls the difference in the information having different alleles of the same gene. That's quite the insight, to realize that these tall plants are fundamentally different from this tall plant. And that oddly enough, when you breed them, these tall plants are exactly like these ones. But this guy is actually just like Grandpa. And this one's exactly like other Grandpa. Does that make sense?
Why did he call it gene though?
Well, like most things in science, it either comes from Latin or Greek. And I believe you know the answer to this because it's the first book of the Bible. Genesis. What does Genesis deal with? The creation of the earth. So gene actually makes a lot of sense because it comes from Genesis, and Genesis means to make or to create. So it's a pretty logical word to choose, right? What makes something have its traits? Well, it's genes, literally the things that make it what it is. It's a well-chosen word, I think, actually. So Genesis is the Greek word to build or to make or to construct. Did that answer your question? Was that what you were asking? Yeah, so it's a good word. Greek and Latin, before like as recently as like the 60s, a classical education, a classical Western education looked very different than your education because everyone studied Greek, everyone studied Latin, everyone. That was like a part, and right from elementary school, everyone studied Greek, everyone studied Latin, everyone studied the classics. So you would know your Aeschylus, and you'd know your Homer, and you'd know your Iliad from your Odyssey, and you'd know your I don't know, your mythology. Like that was just considered an integral part of education. We've moved away from that. I have mixed feelings about that. I think on some level it's like, yeah, we don't need everything to be old dead white guy theater. I get that, and I think that's very true and very important. But some things are lost, and one of the things that's just lost is Latin became the de facto language of science and law. And do you know why? Because what was the biggest empire to ever rule the earth before, like the British Empire, just recently, but the one that had for the longest period of time the most massive land? The Roman Empire. And the legal language of the Roman Empire was Latin. And through what they called Pax Romana, the Roman peace, which is the Romans were famous in that they would go in and they would viciously take over a place, and they would, if anyone rose up against them, they would viciously, slaughter them real good. But if people would just get along and pay their taxes, they could do whatever they wanted. Pax Romana. And the result was that it was this stable empire where for like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, it just kind of thrived. And, and they stretched all the way from Italy where they started out down into Africa, out into Asia, and all the way to Britain, right? So you can go, if you go to London, you can still see the Roman wall in London, and you can still go down to Bath and see Roman bathhouses. And in Britain, they people often find Roman coins in their garden when they're digging. Wouldn't that be cool? Now we can find very cool things here when you dig in your garden too. Anyone ever found we live on native land, right? So you can find things from our history, but that's a part of their history. And so all these cultures for a while had been cultured. The French speak French, but for a while they were conquered by the Romans. So there's still Latin built into their legal system. And the Italians have evolved from the Romans, but they still use Latin in their legal system. And that's true through Germania, all through this area. So even though all these places spoke different languages, they had a common language in these people who'd conquered them, in Latin, which had been integrated into all of their languages. So when science starts thriving, using Latin actually makes a lot of sense because it's a common language from place to place. So when you give things Latin names, even though a French scientist and a German scientist don't speak your language, the names at least have a logic and make sense. And that works well. Now we don't teach Latin and Greek. So and all this stuff sounds so fancy. And if you spoke Latin, this would be like the make stuff type, the what it looks like type. Right? These names are not fancy if you speak Latin. They just describe things. All the fancy Latin names you learn in anatomy literally mean the dark gray shape. You learn all the arteries of the heart, and it's the one that goes under the arm, the one that goes up to the head, the one that goes to the head and the arm. None of the names are fancy if you're a Latin speaker, but again, that's no longer considered part of our general education system. They still do Latin at Sir Winston, I think. Did they have it at Centennial for a while? Yeah. And again, I don't know, my wife studied Latin and Greek in university. So I have a little bit of dabbling, just helping her study for it. But yeah.
Do they still name it in Latin?
We still do, though often now what you'll find is fake Latin. So often now we name things and we just use English words, but we add em at the end, or just things that sort of make them sort of sound faux Latin-esque. Well, that's a whole different thing. But anyway, but yeah, would highly recommend if you go to university and you need an elective. Obviously, you'll go to university for biology or chemistry because those are the things worth studying. But I'm kidding. You should study whatever you like at college, whatever you like at university, whatever you like at trade school. But I will say, if you study classics, I took some old classics electives and I really enjoyed them. Kyla's at Brock right now. She's in biomed, but she's taking classics. I think she's enjoying it. Kyla! Are you enjoying your classics class? You did first semester, right? Yeah, did you like it? Yeah, there you go. Not super enthusiastic, but all right. Anyway, that's all. Carry on. So this is the foundation of what we call inheritance, is that genes get passed on from generation to generation, but for every single trait, you get 2 copies, one from mom and one from dad. And those traits work together. Now, we will mention that Mendel finds that not all traits have dominance and recessive. Most traits have a dominant and recessive allele. For example, the color of the peas themselves. He actually finds that there is a dominant allele that makes the seeds yellow, and there's a recessive allele that makes them green. So what would the possible phenotypes be here? Sorry, try again. What would the possible genotypes be here? How could you put these alleles together? Because again, how many copies does an individual pea plant actually have? 2. So what are the possible combinations? Well, again, that's not very helpful.
Okay. Uppercase, lowercase.
Yeah, sure, we could have uppercase, lowercase, or we could have uppercase, uppercase, or we could have lowercase, lowercase. We would call these, I'm not going to write it again, but what would the kind of fancy Latin word for this be? Is this homozygous?
No.
Heterozygous, good. And in this case, what's the phenotype? If the genotype is dominant recessive, what's the phenotype? Yeah, this one's going to be yellow. What about here? Big Y, big Y. Homozygous dominant, and phenotype will be yellow. And this would be homozygous recessive, and it will be green. Very good. No, listen, you're doing great. Some traits have alleles that are only partially dominant. I'm actually going to go away from plants here for a moment, and we'll look at, there's actually a few genes involved in human hair, but there's a main one, which is human hair. There is a gene C that gives you curly hair, an S copy. They do HC for curly and HS for straight. And the reason we don't use the uppercase for either one is because one isn't dominant. Does that make sense? So in this case, it's a little bit different. What are the possible genotypes? You could have HC and HS, or you could have HCHC, or you could have HSHS. Some of these have easy phenotypes. Give me the ones that have easy phenotypes. Yeah, this one's obviously going to be curly hair, right? What about this one? Straight hair. And basically, there are cases where you get a blended trait. This is wavy hair. Yeah. So in this case, neither is dominant over the other. That's just a different arrangement. Sometimes there's a dominant trait. Sometimes we have what we call partial dominance. We also have something called codominance. Different trait. We'll talk about that a different day. This is the end for today. You're good. I'm done. Time that remains. You shouldn't owe me anything. I haven't given you any kind of assigned work. When we get in on Monday, I will give you a little assignment that you'll have the whole week to work on. That'll be due the Friday before March break. But other than that, I really am trying to get kind of the lesson-y side of this unit done before. Now, let me ask you something else. The second assignment I'm going to give in this unit, I'm certainly not going to. I'm not going to give you something that's due like the day we get back from March break. I won't do that to you. I won't give you an assignment like pointedly over March break. But would you rather, if I have something that we're going to get right when we get back and have it due kind of the middle of that week, would you rather have it over March break and have the choice, or would you rather just not see it and just we'll deal with it when we get back?
Have it on the March break.
How many, by a show of hands, think it'd just be nice to have it? Again, it's not due the day we're back, but if you want to kind of take your time and do a little bit every day over the course of a week rather than that, show of hands. How many people feel like, screw you, I don't want to have to think about biology class over the March break? I hate to tell you guys, but by a show of hands. So again, what I absolutely will not do to you is make something where you have no choice but to do it over the March break. You by all means can ignore it. That's fine. You'll have time when we get back. But what I'll probably do is next week, Monday, I'll give you a project that'll be due Friday of that week. And then the Friday of that week, I'll give you a project that'll probably do the Wednesday or the Thursday of the week we're back. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Okay.
Cool. Yeah. About the which? About what? Sure. Do you want to ask me, or is it like a good for everyone class? I think people are sick of my voice. Why don't you come ask me? I'm certainly sick of my voice. Oh my God.
What is the assignment about this?
I haven't decided which one I'm going to do yet. So I'll tell you when I give it to you. Yeah.
These are drawings, but
No, that's okay.
if two like short trees from the F2 generation that had two tall parents, if like two of them grew together,
You
they'd
tell me.
always be short.
You tell me. Does this have any of that tall parent's information left in it?
No.
No.
So it's just
That is a 100% purebred short plant. Even though it wasn't bred purely, it is purebred in the sense that it only has short information. Does that make sense? It, by random chance, lost all the information from this parent. Because what happened is both of its parents had one from each, and it just so happened to have gotten the information from this parent from mom and the information from this parent from dad. Which means that even though both these parents had information from both, this one only has information from this parent. As far as this one gene is concerned, this parent's been taken right out of the picture. Does that make sense? And this one only has this parent's genes, one from this parent, one from that. These two both are genetically like this. These are mixed breeds. But that's a purebred short, that's a purebred tall, and like genes have no memory. It doesn't know that its parents were mixed breed. For this trait, they're both purebred.
Does it work the same for like human eye color?
Yep. This is also why, like, this is where you get situations where, like, this thing where someone's like, oh my god, somebody must cheat. But there are rare cases where, like, you can have two white parents who have, like, a black baby or something like that. And people are like, oh my god, what happened? But, like, the answer is you can have traits that are kind of hanging out buried in the genome that don't show up. Or, like, you have a redheaded kid despite the fact that, you know, neither parent has red hair. I mean, there's most postman involved. It could well mean that they both have, like, that gene hanging out in there.
So if it's like two blonde people that are would it mean like either their parents, like the child's grandparents have
Yeah.
red hair?
No, I will say, my wife has definitely had situations where she's like, so we know from blood type testing that, like, dad of this baby absolutely is not the dad of this baby. So it can cut both ways. But yeah. Now, keep in mind, we're only talking about one trait. So you have hundreds of thousands of traits, or hundreds of thousands of genes. Somewhere between 100 and 300,000, depending on how you choose to count them. And so the idea that one parent, like, all their traits are going to disappear, no, of course not. But for any particular trait you look at, it is, you know, there's no reason that, like, grandpa's trait just disappears. And if it disappears, it's gone, right? Like, it's not like that's going to then be recovered in further generations. Did that answer your question at all? Oh, good. Look at me.